welcoming you to Dialogue here at E+ TV6 and a conversation with Tony Kail. I will read from his introduction in his most recent work. Tony Kail is a cultural anthropologist, ethnographer, and writer. He holds a degree in cultural anthropology and has been involved in the research of magico-religious cultures for more than 25 years. He's a cultural consultant for local, state, and federal medical and public safety agencies on issues related to cultural diversity, religious culture, and transcultural communications. Good to have you with us.
Good to be here.
His most recent work is called A Secret History of Memphis Hoodoo. And before we get into that, I wanted to find out how you got in this line of work, because I don't know how you would break it to your folks. So what are you going to do with your life, son? I'm going to be a cultural anthropologist, and I'm going to study hoodoo. It's like, okay, son, we need to talk. Right?
Well, you know, growing up here in West Tennessee, the area I grew up in and the time I grew up in, anything...
Which was what? You graduated high school?
In late 80s.
Late 80s,
so,
okay. All right.
But as a child back in the 70s, you know, anything that wasn't, anything that wasn't Southern Baptist was considered a little unconventional, a little bit out there.
Still is, Tony. It still is.
But, you know, I found it was really interesting when there would be cultures that were unfamiliar to this area that would move into this area.
Okay.
And we'd see the dynamics not only between those who were outside of different cultures, local residents, and how those cultures functioned in a society or in a community that didn't really understand them. You know, I remember as a kid when here in Jackson, a Chinese restaurant was like going on some kind of exotic experience to a lot of locals, you know. So, but as time has gone on, the diversity here in Jackson has just grown amazingly, and
the International Festival is a real showcase for that.
Absolutely.
It's pretty interesting to see. What got you involved in this magico-religious thing then in your life?
Well, you know, I had always had an interest in this area, and when I was very, very young, my parents took me to A. Schwab on Bill Street, the old dry goods store. And they used to carry a lot of hoodoo curios, candles and powders and oils. And I remember as a kid sort of being enamored with that, going, what is this stuff about? You know, and I never really understood it. Years later, here in West Tennessee, I met a guy who we became friends, and his grandmother was actually a root worker. She was...
Set the stage for us then as far as root work and all this, because our medicine, I mean, it's heavily pharmaceutical dependent, but we feel a lot better when it's manufactured somewhere. And the idea of going into the earth or going into nature, which is what I guess everybody does still, right? Okay, and doing this because rural people had to have their own medicines, right? Okay, so what was that culture? What did you find when you got into whatever this root work and everything else is?
Well, you know, typically when we talk about hoodoo, and many times root work is used interchangeably with hoodoo, is we're talking about the survival of many of the indigenous traditions out of Africa. When Africans were brought to the New World through slavery, there was this need to preserve this means of survival through medicine and through spiritual practices. And a lot of these practices spoke to not only healing physically, but addressing issues spiritually. We actually found record where as early as the late 1800s that there were slaves in Memphis who were going out in the woods in Shelby County and getting things like slippery elm bark and different trees and plants and using them to heal the slaves, because on many plantations around the Mid-South and the Delta, there was very little medical help for slaves.
All right, and for everybody else. So hoodoo is what then? Because it's not voodoo.
No.
Right? When you say hoodoo, I think people immediately go, ooh, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So what is hoodoo?
Hoodoo is a set of practices derived from these indigenous traditions. Hoodoo's not a religion. Now, voodoo itself is a African religion, and they both are sort of branches from the same tree, which is African traditional religion.
Okay.
With voodoo, there is a intentional worship of these different gods and spirits. Hoodoo, there is no worship of gods and spirits. There is a reverence for God.
Okay.
But in hoodoo, what we saw is these healing and spiritual traditions met with Protestant Christianity in the South. And so, whereas you might have a slave who maybe prays for someone initially and uses roots to heal someone, now they incorporate reading of the Psalms and reading of biblical scripture along with this
starts
practice.
blending.
Yes.
Is there a spiritual side to this, a sense of hexing or power that's beyond us that will heal or maybe hurt?
There
hoodoo.
is a segment of hoodoo that's typically referred to as conjure.
Okay.
And this particular area, there's an old adage about, and you can even hear it in the lyrics of some of the old Delta blues songs where they talk about a two-headed woman.
Okay.
And the inference is that she has one head that's used for healing and one head that can be used for harming or crossing, as they would call it.
Okay.
Most root workers didn't do conjure, but most conjurers did root work.
Do work. Okay. Okay. So the root workers were not necessarily conjurers, but the conjurers were root workers.
In many cases. Yeah.
So how early does this start showing up then in the Mid-South? I mean, we're not as old as the eastern coast of our country and all this other stuff. Jackson's formed in the 1820s in Madison County, also we started organizing. So when does it start appearing here?
You know, we started seeing evidence of root working practices as early as the late 1800s, specifically in Memphis.
Okay.
A lot of the local newspapers in Memphis were carrying these stories about what they were calling voodooism and pagan worship.
Okay.
And they kept referring to these horrendous African slaves that were at one time even feared to be coming into people's homes and stealing children out of homes. And there was this common theme that Memphis was going to become like New Orleans and that voodoo and African spirituality was going to run rampant through Memphis.
Did it do that in New Orleans? Was it different in New Orleans, or was that an exaggeration, or press exaggeration?
Well, I think it was a little bit of both. You know, in New Orleans, we did have that heavy influence of voodoo, the religion of voodoo, but mixed with the reality of voodoo, there was also this public fear of anything related to Africa. And
this is post-Civil War, right?
Yes.
Late 1800s.
Yes.
Okay, so you've got a freed African-American population, and so there's fear of that.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, given the racial tension, the atmosphere at the time, anything that was viewed as tied to Africa was seen as malevolent and some sort of devil worship.
The book is called A Secret History of Memphis Hoodoo. Tony Kail is with us. We'll continue this dialogue here at E+TV6. Welcome back to Dialogue here at E+TV6 as we continue a conversation with Tony Kail. He's the author of this book, A Secret History of Memphis Hoodoo. If you're just joining us, hoodoo is root work and healing and those things.
Yes.
It's not voodoo, which is a religion, sometimes mixed. But there were conjurers that used the spirits, so to speak, to bring healing or harm.
Yes.
So conjurers did root work, but most root workers didn't do conjure.
Right.
Right, okay. So this is in the late 1800s. Are there any Native American, I mean, Native American population had to have survived off of medicine or treatments or things that came from the earth and from here. Was there any mix of that, Tony, that you found in your work?
Yeah, actually there was. There was a folklorist back in the early 1900s named Nubal Niles Puckett in Mississippi. And he did a study throughout the Delta on root workers and conjurers, and he found that a lot of the practices he was seeing was actually married with some Native American practices. And his theory was essentially that many of the slaves felt a camaraderie with Native Americans who had both been oppressed and both were outside the system.
Okay. This root work and healing and all this and using nature to heal is something that's still done. You've got examples here of products that actually, If you went into a store in Memphis, you could buy these?
Yeah, actually, what's amazing is Memphis became home after the war. Memphis became home to a number of companies that mass manufactured hoodoo-related products. They called them curios, and they would call them curios because you couldn't promise that they had any sort of spiritual power. There was a liability with that. So you said they were curios. They were just curious products. But Memphis actually became home to 4 of the largest hoodoo product manufacturers in the United States. We had Lucky Heart Cosmetics, we had Collins Laboratories, we had a company called Hi Hat, and we had a number of different companies that were known all around the world, selling and putting together roots and herbs and things used in root work and conjure.
Well, you got one here called Black Cat Ashes and all this stuff. So what would that be?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's actually not ashes in there. It's actually herbs and incense. In some of the old lore regarding hoodoo, there was a belief that using a black cat bone would bring powder. And in a lot of the old Delta blues songs, you would hear mention of using the black cat bone. Muddy Waters talked about his black cat bone and his John the Conqueror root. The belief was that by using that, you could attain power. Well, when this particular company, Curio Products, came along, they decided to make an alternative to actually using animals is for a product. So they marketed this. This actually used to be available at a pharmacy on Bill Street back in the early 1900s. So yeah,
so it was herbs. It wasn't ashes. It was herbs.
Right.
Ground up. So people, you eat this, you spread this,
you might
cook
put it.
this, or
you might put it in a mojo bag. You might take a bag and put it with that, and put it with a dime. You feed the bag alcohol. And this is a practice that's drawn directly from Africa. We talk about mojo bags when we talk about hoodoo.
So I got my mojo working and all this.
You've got your mojo working. That's where that comes from. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So how prevalent was this?
It is amazing how prevalent it was.
Because we forget there were medicine shows and all kinds of. I mean, when you go back and look at old newspaper ads, I mean, they're selling cure-alls for all kinds of things, right? I mean, so was there a white Caucasian consumption of these products and use of those, or was it?
You know, that's a fascinating chapter in this whole story. In the beginning, the white public looked down on hoodoo, looked down on anything root work related. Then we had an incident that happened in Memphis involving a wealthy white socialite that fell in love with an African-American taxi driver. The taxi driver and her had this adulterous affair, and the taxi driver became very scared because the woman he was with, a woman named Mary Grady, was known in the community, and interracial romance at that time in public was seen as totally taboo. So he decided he was going to pull away from the relationship. Mary Grady consulted a local root worker and asked them, what's going on? And he said, there's a woman named Isabella Walton that lives in downtown Memphis, and Walton has hoodooed your man. And so Grady takes it upon herself to locate Walton, shoots Walton, doesn't kill her, but shoots her. The case.
Was Walton white or black?
Walton was African American. She was, yeah. And so this case goes to court. Basically, the court says you didn't kill her, so there's no murder. Again, given the climate at the time.
Climate at the time, right.
But the amazing thing about this story was the general public in Memphis were not outraged that a woman sought out the spirits to find out about this, nor that there was a woman who was almost murdered, but the fact that there was an interracial romance. And so much of the history of hoodoo in Memphis speaks to racial relations, racial history in Memphis. And years later, it's interesting, back in the late 30s, there was an Anglican minister out of Illinois, Reverend Harry Middleton Hyatt, who put together one of the most historically sound studies of root work in the United States. One of the places he chose to do his research was in Memphis. He stayed at a place there off of Mulberry in downtown Memphis and did interviews. He interviews a lady who lived off of Phillip Street in Memphis, which is probably maybe half a mile from Beale Street. The woman's name was Madam Collins, and she did spiritual readings for people. She advised Hyatt that the majority of her clients were white. Contrary to popular belief that it was strictly the black community coming, but that she had a majority of clients that were white.
So there's a mix then between root work, spiritual insight, or fortune telling, or whatever you're looking for, right? And all of this, And so but it's underground almost.
Yeah, it's very
well. I mean, in some ways, obviously, if this is available in a pharmacy, there's a mix.
Right now, there's a lot of theories, a lot of academics who write and speak on hoodoo say that there's two periods of history. There was the pre-mass retail period of history that was more pure, and then once products started being developed for the general public, that some see that as almost a watering down of the
commercialization of
yes.
it. Okay. But it had to be a reflection of the fact there was widespread usage then, or demand for this, right?
Absolutely. I was visiting with members of the Schwab family who own Schwab's on Beale, and they shared with me that at one time they were literally moving over 10 tons of candles in the glass through their basement up a dumbwaiter to be placed in the store, that they would go through thousands of candles in months. And so the demand was definitely there. It was a huge demand for hoodoo-related products.
So one novelty, it was real.
Absolutely.
A Secret History of Memphis Voodoo. Tony Kail is with us. We'll continue this dialogue here at ePlus TV6. Welcome back to Dialogue here at ePlus TV6 as we continue a conversation with Tony Kail. His book is called A Secret History of Memphis Hoodoo. If you're just joining us, be sure to catch us on replay. We'll catch up on the definition of hoodoo and all this other. When does this go away, Tony, or has it gone away?
Well, we started to see some changes in the culture in the 60s. The word hoodoo became sort of taboo, and people who claim to practice hoodoo or root work.
So when you say hoodoo in the 20s or 30s, it's not considered a sinister or negative thing necessarily?
No.
It depends, or maybe it depends on to whom you're speaking.
Exactly. It depends on who you're speaking. In the 60s, we started seeing some changes. A lot of historians say that many of the root workers and hoodoo practitioners started using terms like spiritualist to replace the term hoodoo or root doctor and things like that, because it carried less of a stigma. And we started seeing many practitioners of African American spirituality moving into church structures. Out of New Orleans, we had a tradition known as New Orleans-based spiritualism, and this was primarily African American based, and it placed a lot of the cultural practices of hoodoo within a church structure. And so we started seeing churches. The Mother Leafy Anderson is the founder of many of the spiritualist churches, and she actually had one of her associates come to Memphis and start a branch of the church there in Memphis.
Did it survive? Is it still there? Or
it didn't.
Now, you said that the Church of God in Christ, there's some that were practitioners within the Church of God in Christ as well, right, in Memphis? Well,
there was a great controversy at one point. One of the founders, Charles Mason, was very enthusiastic about the use of herbs and roots. And he would speak about how God's wonderment appears through roots and herbs. And there were allegations by some in the church that Mason was practicing a form of root work. Now, we don't know. We just know that it has been a great point of controversy.
How detached are we from that? I mean, we would want to think we're not connected to this at all, but then so many medicines are, well, they are derived from natural substances, products, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and many of the medicines that were prescribed, the only thing they're missing is that 3-hour warning at the end of the commercial that tells you about everything that you'll get from using them. You know, something simple like peppermint for nausea.
Okay.
Garlic for cholera. Many of the healing techniques and the roots and herbs were very safe. I mean, they
did they work?
Obviously so. They lasted through this many
centuries,
years.
and
So,
centuries
yeah.
and centuries. I mean, I guess, you know, our species has survived, obviously, off of something out there. Why did you write this? And what is the market, you know, secret history of Memphis hoodoo? You want who to buy this, or what do you want people to see as a result of this work?
You know, learning about hoodoo in Memphis and in West Tennessee was a journey for me. I could not believe the same roads I had walked on as a kid were also walked on by conjurers and root workers, and the same buildings I would go into or the same houses I'd drive by were once occupied by people who were considered spiritual doctors and spiritual leaders. And I really wanted to just let people know this story because hoodoo had such a huge influence on Memphis and most of the Delta that affected everything from race relations. It affected blues music, and so it's part of our heritage. It's part of where we came from, and I think it's something that we also can learn from because. At the end, hoodoo is not just all about mojo bags and black cat bones, but it's about the survival of African spirituality and African healing practices. And I think it's important that we see it survived not only slavery, but segregation. And so I think it's a fascinating part of our local history that hadn't been told before.
Okay. All right. Was it different in Memphis? Was Memphis a unique setting? I see New Orleans would be with a cultural blend there. Was Memphis an unusual pocket that you wouldn't have found in Nashville or somewhere else then? I guess it was.
Well, you know, most of the Mid-South had its own flavor. Now, if you go to the Carolinas or you even go to hills of Kentucky and talk about hoodoo, their hoodoo is primarily influenced by Germanic heritage, Irish heritage.
Okay.
It's a very different flavor. But here in the Mid-South,
in some ways the same. Then I mean, based on
very
natural,
similar cultural practices. Absolutely,
wow.
The same use of herbs, the same use of rituals, the same use of amulets and charms.
Okay, but Memphis had that unusual mixture with the African American presence.
Yes.
Okay, and the Delta presence and all. You know, what did you learn that you didn't know when you started this project?
A lot of stuff.
Okay.
I had no idea. I mean, you know, growing up in this area, you hear things now and then, and you hear rumor and urban legends and things like that. But I had no idea that there was this whole secret world that operated for literally hundreds of years in my own backyard. And it's amazing to know that there are stories of these healers and stories of this culture that have never been told before, and that most of us have no idea what we're looking at when we did see it. So there's a lot that I learned.
If it makes it to manufacture, then there obviously becomes some level of acceptance, commercial acceptance of this.
Yes.
As you say, there was maybe more pure when it was underground or to the side or on its own. Then it becomes commercialized, but it's a reflection, I guess, of something there.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Most of the mass manufacturing of hoodoo curios came about alongside companies that were offering cosmetics to the African American community. Lucky Heart Cosmetics, for example, their focus was hair and makeup products for African Americans. They employed thousands of door-to-door salespeople throughout the United States. And we have record of where a guy from Memphis goes to say, Orlando, Florida, visiting a cousin, and opens his briefcase, and here he has, you know, makeup and blush. But he also has John the Conqueror root, and he also has, you know, stay away from me powder, and you know, so we started
Mary
seeing
Kay with
this.
an attitude.
There you go, yeah.
So it was out there a long time ago. A Secret History of Memphis Hoodoo, and it turns out being our history as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
It does it as well. Tony, appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Thank
What is
you.
next for you then? You follow this up with more? Of course, this is just now coming out. But
Well, you know, it's amazing doing this work. It's sort of like you turn over one stone and another stone turns over right after it. Just since the writing of this, there's been so much material that have come from people that have discovered this book who have families. You know, we were at the West Tennessee Delta Heritage Center and had set up a traveling museum based on the hoodoo culture. And I had a couple come in, and the husband came in and he said, you know, I don't mess with that. My grandfather said that's of the devil. Well, then his wife pulls up to the side and she says, you know, my aunt used to heal us with roots.
okay, there it is.
And so you know,
One door leads to another.
that's exactly right.
It's good to see you.
Good to see
Appreciate
you
this
too,
one.
sir.
Tony Kail, A Secret History of Memphis Hoodoo. Stay with us here at E+ TV 6. This is the place where the dialogue continues.